Hello Steelers, and welcome to this review of Sharp Practice by the Two Fat Lardies, which I'm sure if you're aware of anything else I put on this channel, these are my favourite rules writers, and this is a game that I've been playing for the last couple of years after buying it a little while ago. Now, Sharp Practice has been around for a while. The date here is April 2016, so it's already not 10 years old yet, but it's getting there as I say this. This is actually Sharp Practice 2. There was a version of this beforehand, but this was a revamped version. So I've never played Sharp Practice, the original Sharp Practice 1. I've only played Sharp Practice 2. I've got a couple of the extensions or the bits and the campaigns and things for Sharp Practice 1, but and I can kind of see the differences in them, but it's mainly cards and things like that. There's a few bits and pieces here, but this is an entirely standalone game as far as I'm aware. I don't know how much came over from the original into this. So as I say, this was produced 2016. April of 2016. It is a Wargames rules for large skirmish, as it says, in the era of black powder from 1700 to 1865. So we're covering everything from that early 18th century all the way up to the American Civil War and including it. Basically anything that is using black powder weapons, so that's muskets, the rifles like Sharp himself, hence the name. Although I'm going to say here, I've spoken to Rich about this, and the Sharp Practice itself, although it harks back to Richard Sharp and the Bernard Cornwell novels, this was actually written. Or at least this is what Richard told me, it was written based on George MacDonald Fraser's Flash Heart because of the literary notions of that character and the adventures he got up to, and that is something that comes through very, very strongly in this game. As an introductory game to Napoleonic, for example, or this period Wargaming, I use it for Napoleonics, particularly for the 100 Days campaign. As an introductory game, it's fantastic. You only probably need about 40 or 50 figures aside, so it's really easy to get some figures together. I play it in 15mm, most people play it in 28mm, and it does look great in 28mm. It doesn't suffer for either of the two scales, but I would say either stick to one or the other of those two. If you want, I only do it in 15mm because I have a big 15mm collection. Of terrain and things like that, so there's no point changing over for 28mm for one game, but it does look fantastic in 28mm. Loads of people do it. There are loads of fan-based lists and things out there as well for it. There's a lot of support in the community for Sharp Practice 2. It's probably one of the most popular Two Fat Lardies sets of rules, actually. From what I can see, it probably competes with Chain of Command. Obviously I don't know what the sales are, but I would say from the amount of people that play of the Two Fat Lardies games, Sharp Practice 2 or Chain of Command are always up there. And where every Lardies Day games, there's always at least one or two Sharp Practice games. Same as with Chain of Command, really. But as I say, this is this is the we're looking at this just today as a review of the rules. I want to show you some of the stuff that I really like in this. This, like every other Two Fat Lardies game, is the nuances of the game itself are never actually really revealed until you played it quite a lot, or if you played it with somebody who knows how to play the game. And some of the concepts can be esoteric is probably the wrong word, but they're kind of buried in there, and you do have to work a little bit to tease them out. And once you do tease them out, the game becomes really, really good, and this is good for this. At the heart of it, it's down to cards. I'm going to talk about the cards later on because this is one of my favourite aspects of this set of rules, and it's pretty much, arguably, it's a push your luck system in that you are looking to collect a bunch of cards to be able to do something. I'll talk about that as we go into it, and that's really at the heart of this game in particular. You make a decision immediately, or do you wait on for a better choice? And we'll talk about that as we get actually into the rules as well, because I want to talk a little bit about those. It is absolutely full as well of narrative. This is a narrative game. It's not a tournament game, far from it, like all the Two Fat Lardies games are. It's about fun at the end of the day. It's about having characters, and although I said it's already based on Flash Art rather than Sharp, you could pick any of the Sharp situations, any of the scenarios out of any of the sharp books, and put them straight on the table as sharp practice. It is also a game that really rewards asymmetric forces, so things like the French-Indian Wars, for example, where you have larger forces of Indians who may not be as well armed as the regular forces of the British or the French, and that you really, you're working with the strengths and weaknesses of those sides against each other, so you're not pitted up against exactly the same side. I use it in Napoleonic warfare, so particularly the 100 Days campaign. John McGrath did a really good 100 Days list in one of the Too Fat Lardies specials, Christmas specials, a couple of years ago. That's worth looking for if you're interested in that. Those forces are more balanced, I would argue, but there's still a lot of difference and nuance in them. But it's not like having 12 Indian irregulars versus 8 British regulars, for example. It has been stretched all the way up to the Sudan by John Savage, so you can actually take it beyond what it's supposed to be, and it works really well for those kind of. I've played Maori Wars as well with sharp practice. Again, really good, really interesting games that we played out of those. As I said, lots of narrative. There's also lots of individuals in here that will come to the fore. You can tell their stories as they are playing through the game. So just basically, it's a really interesting, fun game. And let me just read the back to you. It says, Sharp Practice is the ultimate set of large skirmish rules for the Black Powder era, packed with daring do and period flavour. The second edition of the rules has a fast, dynamic game system which sees the action move rapidly along, and it really does. The rules include army lists for the French-Indian Wars, the American War of Independence, Peninsular War, American Civil War, and the Indian Mutiny, with many more lists available online. That's just to mention there, one of the main things I see people playing of Sharp Practice is the Peninsular War. Works really well for that kind of thing. And you may think, it probably doesn't work so well for the 100 Days, but it does, because there were lots of skirmishes, there were lots of little meeting engagements, that kind of thing, as the forces were moving around one another. And this is the kind of stuff that Sharp Practice can really tease out. So what I'm going to do, as I do in most of my reviews, we'll go through the rules itself. We'll look at some of the, I will look at in particular some of the highlights of the rules and the things that I like in here. And I'm going to say before I get into this, I do like this game a lot. My only problem with it, I don't play it enough. There are a few battle reports on the rest of the channel, so go and check those out as well. I want to make some more in future. I've got quite a nice collection of Napoleonic stuff now for Sharp Practice. So this is something that I'm going to be looking at some point in the future. So what I'm going to do now is we'll set the camera up again. I will have a look at this. We'll go through the rules themselves. We'll talk about them, how they work, and as I say, these cards in particular that come with it. I just want to mention the cards. The game deck is available from Too Fat Lardies. You can buy this as an extra addition to the game itself. You don't really need it. All you need is some cards that have got a few different things on them. We'll talk about those as part of this. I got it because I'm a completist and I like to have a card deck for the game itself. But as I say, we can talk about that, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. You just need to mark up. You could just have a basic deck of cards and just mark them up in particular ways. All right. As I say, we'll dive right into the rules now, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more depth. So this is the book itself, as you can see, full colour front, full colour rear as well. Let's have a quick look. 120 pages, page of notes there if you really want it. Adverts for Chain of Command, and a couple of other bits and pieces, War Bases, and also Dux Britanniarum as well. Another Too Fat Lardies game. We've got the introduction there from Rich. Just actually explaining the rules themselves and what they do and how they do it, and then a good set of contents. There is also, which some people, myself, will very be pleased to see, is an index, 3 pages of index there with everything written down, so you can jump straight to where you want, and that is perfect. Always good to see this in rules. Anybody who produces rules without indexes or contents really needs to wobble their head. Right, so look, we've got the game overview, then we've also got the rules, then we've got the appendices as well, which is some other bits and pieces, and then we have the army list as well. So we have in here, I'll just go through these. So we've got the French Indian Wars, the American War of Independence, Peninsular War, American Civil War, and the Indian Mutiny. We'll look at these in a little bit more detail. As I say, the Indian Mutiny stands out here simply because this is where Flashman is doing lots of his stuff. So this is why, as I've mentioned it already, Rich has said to me at least that this is based largely on Flashman and his antics in the Indian Mutiny. So let's jump straight in. So before you begin, it just talks really about the scale of the game. And as I say, it says there's no fixed ground scale in sharp practice. So it says if you're playing with 10mm figures or smaller, we suggest you use centimetres instead of inches, mainly based on inches. Also, what's interesting as well in this is that each unit generally has 8 men, skirmishers have 6, and then irregulars have 12. This is a usual thing. But what you want to do, in some games it says one figure is one man, while in other games a few groups of figures might represent a larger body of men, such as a company. So if you want to make it into a bigger game scale, you can do just by multiplying the number of men on your bases by whatever you want. So we're starting at a base 8 basically, or base 4 I suppose it is. And then from that you can extrapolate out or lower if you want to. So your unit of 8 men could quite easily be 240 men, or 140 men as a company. Or you could represent those figures, you could put a lot more figures on a base, and then just as long as you've got a chit to show how many casualties you're taking, and they take up to 8 casualties, that's all you need to know really. So you can abstract it as much as you want, but a lot of people obviously do it one for one because that's when the personalities come out a little bit more, I think, and that's probably what the game is more suited to. But don't think of it just as, oh, it's only a skirmish game. You can make it much bigger if you wanted to, and there's probably plenty of people out there as well if you want to. Also, just here we talk about the hardware that you use. So it's all dice, D6. It's all based on a D6 game because again, Too Fat Lardies, most of their stuff these days is just 2D, is D6s. Tape measure with inches, obviously. You also need a few tokens as well, so present tokens, uncontrolled fire tokens and shock tokens. You can use these in any way. For uncontrolled fire, I use teddy bear stuffing, so I'll use that as to show that a group is firing uncontrolled. For shock, I use small 7mm dice. For things like that, very simple stuff, quite easily done. And also it says here as well, you will need a deck of cards, or you can use poker chips as well. They do sell chips over at Too Fat Lardies. I'll just quickly show you the cards. So these are numbered up, and as I say, this is a specific one. So we have a number of leaders in red and blue, then we also have command flags as well. So there's quite a few in there, and a tiffin card as well, which ends the turn, which I'll talk about later, you can see. So there's quite a lot. I think it goes up to something like 10 or 12 leaders per side, blue and red being the obvious colours. We're going to come back to the cards in a second when I talk about them and their activations and what makes this game interesting at its core, really. So, ground rules, here we go. It says, well, we do have a ground scale mentioned here, but it says the movement rates and weapon ranges are designed to be practical and look good with 15 or 28mm figures. If you need a guideline for designing your scenarios, then the scale of 12 inches on the tabletop being equal to 50 yards in reality is not a bad yardstick. But as he said, it's already stated there isn't really a ground scale. It doesn't matter so much, but that's just if you're going to take a specific historical scenario. And keeping with the literary theme, the timescale, it says a game of sharp practice is like reading a book. The action moves from one key moment to another with no respect for time. However, each term is sufficiently long for enough troops to stand, reload and fire, which is around 30 seconds. And then a chapter end, which represents a longer lull in the action when the figures take a break or a breather. So it, already is kind of calling back to that literary tradition of reading a sharp novel, for example. So that's a really nice way of making the game more in tune with its outcomes, I guess. It's really nice. So again over here we've got some of the common terms that are used throughout the game, so it's a bit of a glossary at the start just so you can go back to this. I'm not going to go through this in great detail simply because you can read this when you buy the rules yourself, which I'm sure you're going to after this review. And then it also talks about the different types of troops that you would have in your army. Now these are relatively generic, because most troops in most armies are relatively generic. They're based around certain things, so most of them are going to be line troops. Then you might have some elites, you'll have some regulars, conscripts and volunteers, militia, skirmish troops as well, slightly differently. These are made up of light infantry and skirmishers, irregular skirmishers. And then you also have mass troops, which are people like the clans and the tribes and the wallers. And you also have cavalry, although cavalry doesn't always play a massive part in sharp practice given the size of it. There is some though, and it's difficult to kind of use and to time perfectly, really, cavalry in sharp practice. I think that's one of the key things a lot of people talk about. And also artillery. Again, you may only have 1 or 2 artillery pieces on the table. They are relatively rare. They do come in, but you know, you're not going to have mass cannon batteries or anything like that. I think I've only ever played with maybe 1 cannon on the table at a time. Then we have here, this is the unit roster. So this is the relatively important part. Each unit has its own roster in which it has its name here, the type of troop it is, how many points value it is. There is a points value in the game which we'll talk about later on. What weapon they're using, what size they are, so this is basically how many figures they are. You could always think of this as strength points as well if you wanted to have lots of figures. So you could have 25 figures in a British Fusiliers 1777 unit, but it has a strength of 8. So when it takes 8 hits, it's taken off the table or it's broken or whatever. So as long as you've got some way of recording that 8, as I say, normally this would be the amount of figures. So you would have 8 figures in it. When you lose a casualty, you take a figure off. In this case, you could quite easily just replace that with some dice, and then when the dice reach to 8, the unit is gone. It will have broken before then, but you get my drift. Then we have these characteristics, or I suppose these are the skills, I guess. I'm not sure what you would call these really, but these are the attributes. These are the attributes for the units, and everybody has these, which you think, oh well, that's quite what's the word? That's pretty generic. But this is where the changes come in with the different units. So formation is, will the unit fight in a formation or not? Can they form formation? And always means that they can always do it. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. It's either a no or unless they have shock on them, for example. First fire. This is a bonus for the first time that they fire in the game. So when they unload for the first time, they get an extra. I think it's a +1 on there to hit. We'll look at that later on. Controlled volley. This is if they can actually fire as a controlled unit. If you fire uncontrolled, it basically means that you will not be able to do anything else but fire until the leader brings that unit under control. These guys can fire controlled, so they don't need to be able to do that, don't have to do that. Crashing volley is basically a volley fire that will cause twice as much shock. I'll come back to these numbers in a second. Step out means they go faster, basically, and then drill, it just represents how well drilled a unit is. They get an additional d6 of movement to a formation, which is changing formation for this turn. So movement is always on a d6s for these, like all Too Fat Lardy games. It's variable movement, and this is how that works. The 2 here is how many command flags this costs. So I mentioned we were going to talk about command the cards. So each leader that you have has their individual card, but you also have generally 4 command cards, and these are the flags here. So let's have a look, just grab these out. So we've got 4 there, and then 4 for blue as well. And what happens during the game is you will collect these flags as you go, as these come out. So it's you have a deck built up of your numbers of leaders, a tiffin card, and then 4 flags for each side. And as you get these flags, you hold them in your hand, and if you're still before tiffin, you can then spend these when you activate a unit. So you could activate a unit, spend 2 flags, and fire a crashing volley, which will double the shock on the enemy. Or you could get them to step out, which is moving faster. So these are the basics. These are quite nice. And then we also have these here, which is the characteristics. And here we have thin red line and sharp practice. And I'll get to these later on because these are something else. And you can again spend your flags on these characteristics, and this is where the units start to become a little bit different. They're not as generic as what you may think if you've got this kind of unit roster in front of you. So this is where you will be you'll see your strengths and your weaknesses within the unit itself. Right, we're going to come back to this when we talk a little bit more about what the command flags do, because this is the important part of this game, really. We also have the drill manual here, and this shows you the different types of formations that units of the time would have used. So we have a line formation, for example, a closed column, an open column, which allows you to form line pretty quickly to the left or the right, an attack column, a square, skirmish formations here, and then also skirmish screens as well. So all the basic stuff that you would get or you would expect to see in any kind of fighting in this period in particular. Obviously some units are going to be able to do this. Irregular skirmishers, for example, wouldn't be able to, but you know, most trained, drilled units will be able to perform some of these manoeuvres, if nothing else. And they do different things, to be honest. Let me just quickly go through them. So, for example, if you are an individual unit of 8 men, they will take all the shock and they will take all the hits. If you are in a formation, those hits and that shock will be absorbed amongst the different units within it. So you're spreading the fire. So you the thing is with the formations is they are harder to move, but they will take more punishment because you're basically they can fire at them forever and a day, and it's going to take a while before they get broken up. However, if an individual unit within the formation takes more shock and forces them to retreat, then they will break formation, which is a bad things happen, which we'll get to. So some basic stuff here with the preparing to play, just talking about the battlefield, just talking about the different types of terrain. This is all pretty typical stuff that you're going to find in any war game, really. Just some rules about how these things are, how you deal with them. You only have 2 types of cover. Well, we arguably there's 3, because if you're in the open, you're either in light cover or hard cover. This is great because this makes things really easy to remember on the tabletop. You're either in the open, you're in light cover, or you're hard cover, and you can. It gives you some examples. So, for example, light cover could be hedges, standing crops, low garden walls, fences are similar. Then hard cover, heavy stone walls, buildings, entrenchments, or other kinds of things. So you kind of decide before the game starts what the different kinds of cover are and things. But remember, these are firing muskets, so muskets don't have a huge velocity, so they will be, standing corn, 4 foot high corn is going to slow musket balls down. It's not like firing a Second World War weapon through a cornfield, for example. So, real nice, simple stuff that you can remember. You don't have to keep looking back at the book. Once you've played this a few times, you know that you're in either one of 3 covers, and open isn't really a cover. We also have nicely the force morale rules, which are always a great touch. These are in a lot of the new Too Fat Lardy's rules, so chain of command and obviously sharp practice too as well. And you work out what your force morale is, depending on how many militia, regular or elite or clan or whatever you have. You roll the dice and you get a number, and that's what you start with your force morale. This will reduce as you lose figures, or as they get pushed back, or as they lose fisticuffs or various bits and pieces. The force morale will disappear. First one to falls to 0 loses a game. Simple as that. So your entire force won't be wiped out, but their morale will certainly be wiped out. Deployment points as well is another thing. You basically generally have a deployment point on the table. You don't just line up on the back end of a table, as you do in a lot of Napoleonic or this period gaming. And you can also have movable deployment points. You can get these as a support option, and these can then move around a little bit more, but a little bit more flexibility to them and to deploying your troops from. But basically, your primary deployment points are where your troops will be coming from as well. And it says here, deployment points can be noted with a simple piece of terrain or attractive vignette, or even a piece of card. What is important that both sides know where the opponent's deployment is located, so you can make up a nice little set. I've done it for mine. I've got like a little flag party and things. I just put that on the edge of the table. It's just something that looks a bit nice, that's all. Right, this is the interesting part of this game. As I say, the basics of it are pretty simple. So the firing, we'll look at that in a bit. The firing is simple, the terrain is simple. This stuff is really nice and easy because that stuff matters less than the command and control. And this is, again, at the heart of all Too Fat Lardy's games, is about command and control. And it's all about, you know, ensuring that your leaders are in the right place at the right time to do what they want. We already talked about the game deck here, but just to go over it again, we have a card for each of the leaders. We have 4 command flags. We have the tiffin card as well. So depending on how many leaders you may have, in general, I've found I've had between 1 and 4 leaders. It's generally about 3 leaders, so you don't have a massive deck of cards. So let's just say we've got this number here. So we've got a few leaders in here, and each one of these are named or numbered however you like. You can obviously put your own spin on these things, and this is what I said about how you could play this using just normal deck of normal cards. You just have to have 1 to 4 could be your leaders, for example, you know, aces, and then the other cards you just get some other cards. The face cards could be your command cards. Easy enough done. It's just nicer to have the sharp practice card deck itself. So what happens is you will shuffle the deck at the start of the turn. You draw a card, and then if it's a like that, it will go to the player whose flag it is. Red player, blue player. There. We keep going through too many of these. Let me just let's get a leader out. There we go, leader 1, and then that leader gets to activate. And depending on the leader, this is just the number of the leader. It could just be a name. So let's say leader Richard Sharp, for example. They will have a status. The higher the status, up to 4, the better they are as a leader. So they're going to be your officers, for example. Whereas a 1 might just be a sergeant, or even, you know, a lowly. I don't know what they call a corporal in the Napoleonic period, but you know, a lowly guy. And they have an initiative. And they also have a range as well. That's their command range. So a level 4 leader is going to be pretty rare. The most you'll probably have is a 3. You might have a 4 just in case if they're a particularly dynamic leader, but generally it's going to be between 1 and 3. And this is what I've generally played mine. It's been a level 3 leader has been the overall leader, whereas a level 1 and 2 have just been their subordinates. And then they get these command initiatives. This allows them to do different actions, so they can use these for example, to move or to reduce shock from the unit that they're with. And some of these are called commands which are not activations. So this is, for example, rallying shock, to act independently. So this is the leader, to act independently of a group. Call forth a man under his command within his command range who has a specialist skill, so like an engineer or something, and then form 2 groups within one each of each other into a single formation. Undress the ranks as well, which is basically combining 2 groups into one formation as well. What happens, this means, is that this is an activation of the leader but not of the unit. So the unit that they're with can also activate. So he could spend an activation in forming 2 units into one, and then get that unit, if they've got enough initiative, to activate as well as a separate unit. And then the units have 2 activations each, and they can do this. So they can do this is like move, fire, do a firing activation such as loading, for example, if they're loading a cannon, or if they're loading their muskets, or charge, or this kind of thing. And each unit has those 2 activations. Each leader has their initiative is their activations. So for example, a level 3 leader could activate up to 3 units within 9 inches of him, and each of those units would then have 2 actions once they've activated. It's generally better to have your leaders with a unit because they will enhance their fire, they can reduce their shock, and they can do all these kind of things as well, like forming groups together in formations, that kind of thing as well. So that's basically how the units and the leaders work. They're slightly different in that way, and this is something that takes a little while to get your head around a little bit, because they are both quite different in their activations. And there's a bit more information here about how leaders actually work with the units themselves as well. So here, well, here's activating troops, so they can deploy, off the table, onto the table, they can move, they can load, as I say, they can present, they can fire. So there's the basic things that units can do. They're pretty simple. It's the leaders who are doing the interesting stuff and doing the interesting stuff with them. And they can attach or detach from those units. Then we get onto the command cards, and this is where I say this is where the nuance of the game actually comes out. This is where it becomes interesting, and it becomes a push your luck mechanic for the rules themselves. So I've already said that you will activate your leader on their card turn, but you will also at the same time be collecting your command cards. So you will have up to 4 of these. Now, if the Tiffin card is pulled, this ends the turn. If the card ends the turn, once the Tiffin card is ended, if you have any of these cards in your hand, they just then revert to activating units which have not yet activated. So at the end of a turn, these are pretty weak. They don't really do a great deal, apart from getting a unit to do something. And we've already seen the units can't do a great deal of things apart from fire or move, for example. So you could get a unit to fire if it hasn't done anything, and that would cost you 1. However, before the Tiffin card, these become really important, and the more you have of these, the more important they become. So you can take, for example, during a turn, you can use any number of command cards. It can be used by a leader to increase his command initiative for the turn. So if you've got a level 2 leader, you could add up to 3 cards, turn him up to a 5, and then he could activate 5 units around him. So if you get these early on in the turn, and then pull that leader's card out, you could then get the jump on the enemy by just spending those cards and getting your leader to do basic activations. He can then also direct fire with a number of cards, and they are added onto the dice that you're going to be rolling for firing as well, so that's a nice thing, and that's pretty simple. Any number of command cards can be used by a leader to encourage a unit in fisticuffs, so again you're just getting an addition on the dice. So for when they're in hand-to-hand combat, which is the fisticuffs is the name in sharp practice. Then we have 2 command cards, allow 1 group or formation not yet activated to immediately take its activation. But these can't remove shock, but they can fire or they can move. So that's just cost you 2 cards. So that's pretty good, because again it means you can get the jump on the enemy. So you can, if you're in a position and they're ready to fire at you, you can play your 2 command cards, get them to fire first, for example. 3 cards will allow a leader not yet activated to take his turn. So then he can activate the units around him as well. So again, that's better than just a single unit. This is now a leader who is doing this. Also with this, you can 3 command cards. You can use 1 leader to launch an ambuscade from a deployment point. This means you basically deploy up to 12 inches and you can go straight into fisticuffs with an enemy unit. So you're basically jumping forward onto them. So it's worthwhile sometimes keeping a unit off the table in case the enemy are getting close to your deployment point and shutting it down. And then the big one here is the 4 cards. Let me find that other fourth card, wherever it is, just to give you a visual representation of what 4 is, in case you don't know what 4 is. This is excellent because this allows one leader to activate immediately as a bonus activation, and he can use his command initiative to activate units within his round, even if they've already been activated in this turn. So this is where the push your luck bit comes in, because you want, this is the big one. 4 cards is great. So if you are sat here with 3 cards and there's only 4 cards left in the deck, do you wait? Do you wait for that 4th card to come out of the deck? Do you hope it's going to come out? Because if it does, you then get a double move for one leader and all the people within his command initiative range. And that is well worth it, because obviously that's a massive bonus. Really nice. However, as soon as this comes out, the tiffin card, these suddenly become relatively worthless, and then you can only activate units that haven't already activated. So it's that, do you wait on and do you hold on for it, or do you use it and just try to get the best you can out of the card at the time? And this is really where Short Practice is such a good game, and why it makes it so interesting and gives you a really good command choice as a leader in the game, with your leaders as well, and with the cards. The game is about the cards as much as anything else. The rest of it is dressing, window dressing for this card play, and this is really where it comes down to. And this is, this is the point where Flashman steps up onto the battlements and pushes back the attacking Indians, for example, or does he wait, gets the tiffin card, and then the Indians overwhelm them? It's the difference between those 2 cards. And this, I think, is really where the game comes alive. And it adds that narrative feel to the game, because you don't know whether to hold on just for that extra card, or whether it's worthwhile using it for its best situation at the time. I do apologise. Actually, an ambuscade is you don't move 12 inches, you move 3d6 inches to attempt to make contact. So you could move potentially up to 18 inches, and you also double any shock that results from the first round of fisticuffs. So it's a really nice way of just keeping a unit off the table, hold them back, wait until the enemy gets close to you, and then just launch an attack on them and double their shock on them. That's the idea. So yes, we've already said at the end of the turn, any units can only be activated now by the cards that you've got in your hand. So this is the issue of playing the cards or not. Random events, should I say, come up when 3 command cards of any colour are dealt in a sequence. So you get 3 command cards out, you will then get a random event. Random events are rolled on 2d6. Depending on what the last unit that's activated did, if they moved or they fired, so firing here and then a moving random event. Those are 2 random events. Again, a little bit of a narrativization of the game itself, just a bit of fun in there, just making things go a bit crazy. So let's have a look, show you what. So it says, for example, let's find an interesting one. Hello ladies, 1d3 men are convinced that a nearby building is home to some rather beautiful ladies, and they slip away to present their cards. The player who owns the figures must immediately select the men and move them away to the nearest building. So you've got little things like that. You don't really need to have the random events, and if you don't want to, some people don't like them so much, but they just add a little bit of fun to the game, I think. And it's all in the spirit of the Flashman novels, I would say. Then we also have a chapter end as well, and this is when the tiffin card is the first card that is dealt in the turn. And then various things happen in that chapter end. So stuff like unloaded groups will be reloaded automatically. Broken troops with double their number or more in shock are removed from the table, so they're off. Any leaders will also take, and then a forced morale test of bad things happens to them. Buildings that are on fire, unstable, will collapse, that kind of thing. So this is a moment when all the bits come together at the end of the chapter. Alright, let's just have a quick look at some of the movement. I don't want to go too much into the basic rules because they're very simple. They're very similar to a lot of other Too Fat Lardies rules, and they are kept specifically simple so you're not looking back at the book to while you're playing. That's the whole idea. The focus should be on the tabletop. Obviously, you can't always have that, but in general, the rules for movement are pretty simple here. I've already mentioned each unit will get 2 actions. They can basically, a single group will roll a dice per action. They take an inch off for every shock that they have as well. So at full, you would be rolling 2 dice. You could also spend those command cards. Remember earlier on, things like step out, you get an extra dice for your movement, this kind of thing as well. So you can use those command cards for other things beyond those that we just talked about a minute ago, remember. So then it talks about formations, how they move, how they activate on the table as well, how terrain affects movement and things like that. Again, a lot of this stuff is pretty simple stuff for most wargaming rules you'll be aware of. So I'm just going to kind of flick through some of this a little bit. Also, we got some rules here for treasure. If you find the enemy has wagons or carts and things, they may go and loot them if they come into contact with them, that kind of thing. So again, just adding to that narrative of the game itself, just a bit of fun really. Cavalry is slightly more complicated because you need to know what speed they're going at, and then they go up or down a speed basically. As I say, cavalry never seems to be really used a great deal in sharp practice from what I've seen. But it is used, but there are some rules for it. Then we have firing rules. How 180-degree arc fire for anybody. What the line of sight rules. Some great illustrations throughout these sets of rules, just so you can see exactly examples of who can fire and how they can fire. How you work from a building, firing out of windows and things. Those who are familiar with chain of command will see a lot of familiarity in here. There's very similar things that go through both rules, so the basic stuff. The difference here is that because we're firing with muzzle loading weapons, they're going to take a lot longer to fire. So you actually fire and then you have to reload, and that's 2 actions. One of the great things you can do is the sharp practice. If you have sharp practice, you can actually spend 2 command cards. I think it's 2 command cards, and then you can just ignore one of the firing moves. So basically you can fire and then reload with your sharp practice and then fire again in the same turn, because that's only 2 actions, you're ignoring one. So it's a really nice way of again using those command cards at the right time when you need to. We've got a master arsenal table here. There's a couple of other weapons here and there, but the master arsenal table pretty much covers everything. So you got everything here from muskets, single shot pistols, the rifled carbines, rifle muskets, that kind of thing as well. Then also some weapons, some artillery weapons, different sizes. Bits of stuff about rockets, just in case you want to use those. And as I say, the firing procedure is basically you roll a number of d6 depending on how many men are firing, depending on what the weapon is. You're either firing at close, effective or long. Most weapons, for example, the musket is the most obvious one. It only has a close and a long range. Up to 12 inches close, 12 to 24 is long. So you're hitting on a 4 to 6 or a 6. Really simple stuff to remember, but once you've memorized some of these bits and pieces, this is easy. Then you get firing adjustments where you can get pluses. So this is, for example, the first time, if you've got the first fire skill, first time that you fire in the game, you will get a +1 to hit. If your skirmishers firing, you get +1s to hit because they're just better, and they're also not packed as tightly as a line infantry unit would be as well. So very simple stuff. Then we have the hit effects, and you're either killed, your shock, or it's a miss. If you're killed, it's a man out. You lose a strength point, say for example, or a figure off the unit. If it's shock, they take shock. The more shock you get, the harder it is to move, the harder it is to fire. It's a really good way of seeing morale on the tabletop itself. Perhaps your leader is a casualty. If you take 2 or more hits, then you have to roll d6. If you get below that number of kills, then he has been hit himself or she, depending on the leader. And then they have a casualty table there. Then we've got the uncontrolled fire. We mentioned this before. So troops that don't have firing control volleys can stop at any time. However, uncontrolled units that don't fire with control volleys have to be brought back under control by their leader. And then they have to roll the dice to see if they remain uncontrolled or they follow orders. If they remain uncontrolled, they just carry on firing. So that's simple. If you want them to move, you've got to try to get them to move. Then we have a coverage of shock itself. Again, I'm not going to go through this in any massive way, but this is basically the morale system in Too Fat Larry's games. Shock just builds up, it slows your units down, it makes them worse at firing, and also it can break them as well. If there's more shock than troops, they will then fall back. Also, if you'll break up as well, break a formation, you will take shock and things like that as well. It's all part of it. Fisticuffs is close combat. It's very, very bloody. You basically, depending on how many of the units, the strength of the unit is. So, for example, line troops, if you've got over 50% left, you roll 6d6. If you're less than 50%, it's 3d6. So this is what I say, you could quite easily just turn those 8 numbers into strength points, and then if you've got over 5 strength points, you're rolling 6d6. If less than 3d6. So it doesn't matter how many men are in there, it's about those strength points. Call them Elan points, I suppose, same as in Blucher or something like that. Then you just get a load of pluses or minuses of the dice, adding dice. 5s and 6s are kills, 6 cause shock, and then also you can have a result as well. They may be pushed back or they may fight again, depending on how they go. And then we cover force morale. Every time something happens, which is a setback, so a group forced to withdraw, or it breaks, or it's wiped out, or your various status leaders are killed, or wounded, or routed, or they do a cowardly act, you roll a bad things happen, and whatever it rolls, you take it off your force morale. Get to 0 force morale, you have lost the game. Nice and simple. This is where the interesting stuff comes in as well. Another layer on top of this is adding characters. You can actually roll up your character's background, various leaders if you want to, so they can be risen from the ranks all the way to minor nobility, minor royalty, extravagant wealth and great influence. Then their personality, and what this also will affect what they do in the game. I don't really play with this stuff, but I should do because it's fun. You don't have to. It's just another little layer on top of the game itself, just to give it all that bit of narrative and just a bit of fun, as I say. And then you can even go on as far as well as rolling up their physique, their looks, their skills, their charisma, and also foreign Johnnies as well, who are other fellas outside of the general literary heroes of the day as well. So these are the enemies and things like that you may come up against. And you know, there's quite a lot about characters in this, so you can really bring it out, and it's almost getting onto role playing at this point, you know, where you've got these characters with various different skills and things and what they're going to do and how they're going to act. So it's just adds a bit of fun to the game itself. As I say, this is what it's all about. It's about just bringing out that narrative fun in the game. Wargaming should be fun. Over here we got tasks. We mentioned these before, so a leader can get a man to do a task, or a figure to do a task or two, and this is things like breaking down doors, breaching a palisade, how long they take them to do, and then you just roll dice against it and reduce that number until it gets to 0, and then it has happened. So the harder the task, the longer it'll take to do, for example. You can also have deeds of daring do. Then you can also have challenges on guard, so you can have duels as well between two characters, this kind of thing as well. So all this fun will just add on to the game itself. Then we got to the appendices. This is the scenarios. So this is how, just basically tells you the basic scenarios in the game. I think there's 6 in here. Yes, you roll a dice, and that'll tell you which scenario you're playing, and each one gives you the how you set the table up, where your deployment points are, how many support points you have, which we'll talk about in a second, and then anything else like terrain and minor characters that may appear in the table as well. So we've got an encounter, sweep the table, defense in depth, escort duty, attack on an objective, and then rescue mission as well. They're the basic ones in here, but you can make any scenarios you want as well. You could add even more character as well in here if you really want to, and this is for campaign settings. And there is actually Dawns and Departures, which is a campaign system for sharp practice, which you create. I have got it, but I've yet to actually play it. We had an online game with Andy Crow and Tom Egan. We were playing a French-Indian Wars version of it, and it was going well so far. And then then we kind of stopped playing it. But it's an interesting way of looking at campaigns, but just adding more character to it. Then we go on to the army list as well. We'll go through these quickly because I realise how long this review is at this point. So basically, you select your basic force, you select your supports, and then any support options as well on top of that. And you have generic support lists, which are here. The way this works is you generally roll d6, or you have a number of support points, and this gives you your support. And then you take from these lists what you want, and you've got up to list 6 here. So for example, a status 2 leader will cost you 6 points out of whatever support points you have, whereas a physic will cost you 1 point, and it's whatever list the number they are in is how much points it costs. Really simple way of doing it, really nice way of doing it as well. And it also means that both sides don't have the exact amount of support, same amount of support in every game, because you're going to be rolling those dice, so it's slightly different. And then this just goes through what those different support options are. I've mentioned them already. We have these automatically applied characteristics. This is in the characteristics in the units as well. So some of these things are automatically applied. So like, for example, aggressive, you will fight better in fisticuffs. Good shots, you get an additional d6 for each group firing. In hand, superbly trained cavalry will double any shock rallied from them when they're stationary or moving away from the enemy. These are things that just happen to the units. The other stuff is these card triggered characteristics, as I mentioned it here as well, mentioned previously. So for example, sharp practice is the one where you can ignore a step in that firing. So that is firing, reload, or presenting, firing, reloading. You can ignore any of those steps if you want and just continue. So you can fire quicker if you really want to. And this costs whenever 2 command cards are played. If you've got the skill sharp practice, you can do that, so you can just ignore it and just keep throwing those down, and just making sure that they're keeping the firing going. So as I say, potentially you could fire twice in a turn. Normally with muskets you wouldn't be able to, because you've got to at least reload, whereas having this, if you're already got your unit presented, that's even better. So your first shot would be a presented fire, then you would use your you would then reload with your second shot, and then thirdly you could play your 2 cards and then get a second shot in straight after. Things like this, using tactical, you can perform an ambuscade when they're activated and have 2 command cards, so it's cheaper than doing it with the normal 3 cards. Cavalry attacks with a LAN, again with 2 cards. Thin red line, it's widely applied to British forces across, and then when they use 2 command cards with a leader's activation, the group or formation may fire a volley or charge with 3 actions. Sorry, they may fire a volley and charge with 3 actions of movement. It's really nice to be able to get them into close combat after firing a volley at the enemy, so that's a good way of doing it. But let's have a look at some of these army lists. Generally, your force will be around about 30 to 40, 50 points ish, and you can see here points values for most things are about 7, 6. They go up to 8 for British light infantry skirmishes, for example. And this is basically, these are not worked out very specifically, I don't think. They're just, a roundabout number. So you could if you probably sat down and tried to work these out, why one is worth 6 and one is worth 7, you probably wouldn't find an answer. They're pretty rough numbers, I think. I could be wrong on that, but I think they're pretty rough numbers. But here we've got French-Indian War, so we've got everybody here from British regulars coming through to frontier militia, colonials, British artillery, Indian allies, settlers, so quite a lot. And as I say, this is almost counterinsurgency kind of stuff. This is asymmetric warfare, definitely. And then we have as well a couple of forces for you already. So French force 1755 is worth 60 and gives you a group. So let me just go through this so you've got an idea of how big a force would be in sharp practice. So you have your status 3 leader, so that'll be 1 figure, 2 8 marine infantry, so that's 16 figures, a leader status 2, and then 2 groups of 6 milice Canadian military muskets, so that's another 12 men. A status 2 leader, and then 2 groups of 12 Indians, so that would be 24 figures, and then 1 movable deployment point. And then you would also have on top of that your support force support as well. But that gives you an idea. That's quite a big force. On average, the ones I've been playing have been about 45 points. So the French and Allies are covered there. Then we've got the American War of Independence, so we have British and Allies, and once again we've got some basic units that you can use here. Then we've got the colonials, rebellious colonials as they're called, rebellious colonist forces, sorry. And again, lots of different types of units in here, and these are all very different. Peninsular War, a lot of people play sharp practice for the Peninsular War stuff. Again, that really harks back to the sharp novels. And once again we have a group here. This one's an interesting one, the Literary Detachment. This is very much Sharp himself. So status 2 leader, leader 2, leader 1, 3 groups of 8 light infantry, then a status 3 leader, Sharp, status 1 leader, and then 3 groups of 6 95th rifles. They're the rifles, and that is actually 75 points. That's quite a large number for a sharp practice game. You've also got Portuguese forces, Spanish forces in here, French forces, quite lots of French forces, as you can see. And then we go on to the American Civil War, which is the last one. I thought, no, there's the Indian Mutiny, but we have the Confederate forces. That's obviously here, and then also your typical Union forces on top of that. And then finally the Indian Mutiny, so this is the British forces here, and then once again we have the mutineer forces, so the rebel forces here. Now we go on to the index as well. So there's actually tons and tons of stuff just in here that you can choose from your particular given period of play. But as I said, online there are lots and lots of force lists that people have come up with on the Two Fat Lardies forum. Also, you know, in various other bits and places across the, I think in the Sharp Practice Facebook group as well. And that's basically, well, that's pretty much my review of the game done, because I've got to the end of it there. But hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of how this game works. I really like it because of this card mechanic that is a push your luck mechanic, and I really like push your luck in games. The idea of, you know, do you hold on to the cards you've got and wait it out and hope the tiffin card doesn't come up, or do you gamble and just wait and get those 4 cards and then go, or do you use them as you want to use, you know, do you use them immediately? And I think that's a really nice way of the game playing. And as I say, the actual basic rules of it are pretty simple. After a few games you'll probably not be looking at the book just to check stuff. You know, you might want to check 1 or 2 things like random events and that kind of stuff, but apart from that, overall you will be pretty fair with the rules pretty quickly. I find I played a few games of it and I can pretty much remember most of the basics even now, and I've not played it for a good few months at this point. But anyway, that is my review of Sharp Practice. I'm sorry it went on for a long time, but there's a lot in this, a lot more in this game than you would initially think of, I think, and that's the point of it. That's what it makes it interesting, the fact that you've got to tease out those little nuances of the rules themselves, and just to make the game interesting and make it unique and make it a good, fun narrative adventure in the period of the Black Powder. Well, as I say, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this review. If you have, let me know in the comments. If there's anything that you think I've missed, or if there's anything that you think I should have mentioned, then please do let me know, as always. And check out Short Practice. As I said, it doesn't have to be a skirmish game if you don't want it to be. It's just really, it's down to you as a player, how you want to play the game, and that is, to me, a good way of playing. So I'll leave it at that. I'll say thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel. Also check out Patreon and also my channel memberships, where you will get early access, ad-free access to my videos, and thanks on the thanks list. So I shall see you in the next Storm of Steel video.